A huge tornado hit St. Louis and East St. Louis. In just 20 minutes, it destroyed whole neighborhoods, killed more than 250 people, and left thousands with nothing. How could one storm cause so much damage so quickly? A late afternoon calm. May 27, 1896. St. Louis, Missouri. The sun is lowering, workmen shutting down factories, children returning home. Without warning, the skies darken. A monstrous funnel descends. Within minutes, entire blocks of a major American city vanish. Churches collapse. Homes swept away. In 20 minutes, over 250 lives are lost. Tens of thousands are left homeless. This is not the storm that people expected. It is the Great Cyclone that changed St. Louis forever. In the spring of 1896, the United States was no stranger to severe storms, but nothing in the memory of St. Louis prepared its citizens for what would come that day. The country was in a period of rapid urban expansion. St. Louis was booming railroads, factories, dense neighborhoods, close quarters, structures built for function, not for resisting furious winds. Weather forecasting was rudimentary. The best forecasters could predict thunderstorms. The idea of a tornado ripping through downtown was almost unimaginable. On Wednesday, May 27, 1896, the Weather Bureau predicted storms. Thunderheads gathered, but many believed the worst would pass over. In the morning, nothing indicated the scale of catastrophe that would hit in the evening. Around 5:00 p.m., residents looked up as the atmosphere shifted, winds picking up, skies turning ominous. A whisper of dread spread through the streets. Within moments, it turned into pure destruction. This tornado was part of a larger outbreak sequence from May 24 to May 28, 1896, a series of violent storms that swept across the central and eastern United States. At least 26 tornadoes touched down during this period. Fatalities across the outbreak rose to at least 388, injuries well over 1,000. Among them, the St. Louis, East St. Louis tornado stands out, not just for its deadliness, but for striking one of America's major urban centers. To understand the significance, it is important to see how rare such a sequence was in the late 19th century. The United States already knew tornadoes as a seasonal menace, especially in the Great Plains, but a chain of storms of this magnitude shocked even seasoned farmers and weather watchers. The late May sequence was a week of near-continuous dread, with daily reports of cyclones tearing through small towns, flattening farms, and leaving telegraph operators rushing to send out casualty lists. St. Louis was not the only place struck, but it became the tragic centerpiece. Meteorologists of the day could detect unstable atmospheric patterns, warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico surging northward and colliding with drier, cooler air descending from the plains. Add to this the sharp cold front sweeping eastward, and the result was an atmosphere primed for explosive development. Today we would describe this as a classic setup for supercell thunderstorms, but in 1896, the vocabulary did not exist. Observers spoke instead of heavy electrification, sullen clouds, and sultry airs. Farmers who worked their land by instinct felt the warning signs in their bones. Animals restless, the smell of ozone, an oppressive stillness before the storm. But there was no radar, no satellite imagery, no storm-chasing teams broadcasting warnings in real time. Most alerts were based on visual observation, barometric readings, and the hurried dispatches of regional weather bureaus. The Weather Bureau, barely a decade and a half old, was still developing protocols for storm prediction. At that time, even the word tornado was controversial. Forecasters were discouraged from using it publicly because officials feared it would cause panic. Instead, warnings often used the phrase, severe local storm. On that fateful afternoon in St. Louis, one ominous sign was unmistakable. The barometer in Lafayette Park fell to an extraordinary low of about 26.74 inches of mercury. Such a reading indicated extreme atmospheric instability. Residents who noticed it might not have grasped the scientific implications, but they sensed danger. In those days, barometers were common fixtures in businesses, homes, and schools. Shopkeepers sometimes set them near the door as both decoration and weather tools. A plunging needle was enough to draw murmurs of alarm. The storms earlier in the week had already seeded anxiety. Towns in Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas had seen twisters cut paths of ruin. By the time the atmosphere shifted over Missouri on May 27, many citizens already felt uneasy. Yet no one imagined that one of the largest cities in the nation, a bustling hub of commerce and culture, would be struck at its very heart. Tornadoes were expected on the open plains, not downtown districts with factories, mansions, and ornate churches. As evening drew near, the air grew stifling. Accounts from the period describe a strange half-light, as if twilight arrived early. Dark clouds massed in the southwest. Gusts came and went, followed by sudden calms. Some remembered birds vanishing from the sky. Children playing in Lafayette Park recalled being hurried home by mothers unsettled by the atmosphere. Along the Mississippi riverfront, stevedores loading barges noticed the river's surface turning choppy, whipped by erratic winds. The Great Outbreak sequence did not produce just one tornado, but an entire family of storms, each carrying destruction across a wide swath of the country. In parts of Kentucky, Arkansas, and Illinois, small towns were battered the same week. The combined toll meant that telegraph lines carried a near-constant stream of grim updates. Newspapers struggled to keep up, columns filling with casualty numbers and vivid sketches of ruined farms. Yet the St. Louis tornado dwarfed the rest, not only in lives lost, but in the cultural shock of a great city humbled in minutes. It is important to appreciate the limitations of science at the time. Meteorology was still emerging as a professional discipline. Instruments like the anemometer, barograph, and standard rain gauge were in use, but coverage was patchy. Storm chasers did not exist. Tornado research would not gain momentum until the mid-20th century, with the advent of Doppler radar and aerial surveys. Thus, much of what we know about the 1896 outbreak comes from meticulous notes by local observers, weather bureau agents, and the painstaking reconstructions of later historians. One such observer, stationed in St. Louis, recorded not only the barometer's plunge, but also the sky's extraordinary colors. Greenish clouds layered over darker masses, flashes of lightning illuminating the horizon. These accounts match what modern meteorologists identify as the visual hallmarks of tornadic supercells. Another observer noted a rotating cone descending, first mistaken for heavy rain, until debris began rising into the sky. For residents of the city, the line between storm and catastrophe blurred in an instant. Across the Mississippi Valley, telegraph wires hummed with urgent messages. Cyclone sighted, railway yards demolished, towns swept away. Yet the pace of communication was no match for the storm's speed. By the time word reached many communities, the tornado had already passed. St. Louis, in particular, received almost no advance notice. The warning system of the 1890s simply could not deliver timely alerts to urban populations. Another factor that magnified the disaster was population density. St. Louis in 1896 ranked as the fourth largest city in the United States, with nearly 500,000 residents. Neighborhoods were tightly packed with brick row houses, wooden cottages, and tenements. Industrial zones stood side by side with residential districts. Once the funnel dropped into the city, there was no open field to dissipate its fury. Every block meant lives at risk, structures to be destroyed, livelihoods to be erased. The larger outbreak sequence also offers insight into the climate of the period. The late 19th century was a time of volatile weather events across the United States. Great blizzards, floods, and droughts had shaped public consciousness. The tornadoes of May 1896 fit into this broader pattern of natural extremes. Scientists today analyze tree rings and climate data to understand how atmospheric circulation patterns contributed. It is likely that a strong clash of warm Gulf air and cooler northern systems created an especially unstable corridor across the Midwest that week. In modern terms, meteorologists would describe the setup as featuring high convective available potential energy, CAPE, strong wind shear, and lifting mechanisms ideal for supercell development. But for the people of 1896, such terms were unknown. They saw only a sky that grew darker, winds that twisted without warning, and a storm that defied comprehension. The barometer drop remains one of the most striking statistics from that day. At 26.74 inches of mercury, the reading was among the lowest ever recorded in the region. For comparison, average sea level pressure hovers around 29.92 inches. Such a sharp fall indicates not just a thunderstorm, but a massive, organized system. Meteorologists today note that extreme lows like this are consistent with violent tornadoes of F4 or F5 strength. Though the Fujita scale did not exist then, modern analysis of the damage supports the classification. The human experience of the outbreak was a mixture of fear, awe, and helplessness. Families huddled in basements or under stairwells praying. Some crowded into churches, hoping the sanctuaries would shield them. Others ran into the streets, seeking open space. Accounts describe a roar like 100 trains, debris spinning in the air, and the uncanny sensation of being lifted off the ground. Survivors spoke of time slowing down, of entire houses dissolving in seconds. The broader sequence of tornadoes also meant that relief efforts were strained. Communities across several states were already calling for aid. By the time St. Louis was struck, supplies, doctors, and rescue crews were stretched thin. Trains carried volunteers from nearby towns, but many lines were damaged or blocked. Telegraph wires snapped, further isolating the city. Thus, the St. Louis disaster was not only part of a meteorological outbreak, but also a logistical crisis, testing the capacity of late 19th century America to respond to natural calamities. This context makes the St. Louis East St. Louis tornado both a singular tragedy and a chapter in a larger story of atmospheric violence. The week of May 24–28, 1896, became etched in weather history. Later generations of meteorologists studied the event to better understand outbreak dynamics, urban vulnerability, and the limits of prediction. For the people who lived through it, the memory was simpler, harsher. Skies that turned green, a barometer needle plunging, and then a fury of wind that erased entire lives in minutes. The tornado first touched down near the city poorhouse on Arsenal Street, just east of Hampton Avenue in St. Louis. It carved a path through the city's heart. Entire neighborhoods were caught. Lafayette Square, Compton Heights, Mill Creek Valley, factories, homes, churches, railroad yards, all were in its path. The downtown core, built densely and without modern reinforcements, suffered massively. In some blocks, buildings were not just damaged, they were completely obliterated. Some homes were virtually swept away. The corridor of destruction was about 1 mile wide at its peak in St. Louis. Trees were uprooted by the thousands in Lafayette Park, over 36 acres of green space flattened. Saloons, schools, churches succumbed. The barometer drop was sudden and marked. Witnesses said walls collapsed, chimneys toppled, debris flew like shrapnel, windows shattered. The streets became chaotic. For many residents, the violence came almost without warning. One moment the city hummed with its usual rhythms, carriage wheels clattering on cobblestones, whistles from factories, children playing in the spring air. The next moment, an unearthly roar filled the sky. People described the sound as a freight train bearing down, though many had never even stood near such machines. Others said it was like the growl of the earth itself, a low vibration that shook the chest before the winds even arrived. Then came the wall of destruction. In Lafayette Square, known for its elegant houses and tree-lined avenues, the storm showed no mercy. Stately mansions built by merchants and professionals, homes that represented prosperity and stability, were torn open as if made of paper. Roofs lifted into the air and disappeared. Brick walls folded in on themselves. Families who had built lives in these houses suddenly found themselves in open air, surrounded by rubble. The square's iconic park, once a lush refuge of oaks and maples, was reduced to a battlefield of splintered trunks and stripped branches. In Compton Heights, one of the newer districts filled with fashionable homes and community pride, residents thought their sturdier brick construction might provide safety. They were wrong. The tornado peeled roofs, crushed gables, and threw heavy timbers blocks away. Some survivors recalled being lifted off their feet and deposited dozens of yards from where they had stood. One woman, caught near her front porch, later testified that she remembered nothing until she awoke in a field, bruised and bloodied but alive. Her house was gone, her neighbors missing. Mill Creek Valley, a dense neighborhood filled with working-class families, fared even worse. Wooden cottages and boarding houses offered little protection. The storm ripped through in seconds, leaving behind flattened blocks. The poorest residents, many without basements, had nowhere to hide. Families huddled under tables or against interior walls, but few structures could withstand winds of such magnitude. Here the death toll was especially high, and rescue workers days later reported finding entire families crushed under beams or suffocated in collapsed rooms. The devastation revealed not just the randomness of the storm, but the unequal burdens carried by the city's poorest citizens. The industrial areas of St. Louis were not spared. Factories producing everything from beer to machinery lost their roofs and windows. Smokestacks toppled like toys, crushing workers and machinery below. Railroad yards, the lifeblood of commerce, saw entire cars overturned. Tracks were twisted and bent. Telegraph poles snapped in sequence like brittle twigs, severing communication across districts. The city's economy ground to a halt in the very minutes it most needed coordination. Religious institutions, often thought of as sanctuaries, also fell victim. Several churches lost spires, stained glass windows, or entire walls. Parishioners who had gathered for evening services found themselves trapped beneath beams and plaster. Rescuers later pulled worshippers from beneath pews piled high with debris. The symbolism was stark. Even houses of God could not withstand the storm's wrath. Eyewitness accounts add texture to the destruction. One man described watching entire blocks lift and spin like dry leaves, the air filled with a haze of mortar dust and flying wood. Another said he saw horses carried into the air, hurled into fences and walls. Survivors staggered out of wreckage bloodied, their clothes shredded by splinters, many in shock and unable to speak. Families searched desperately for missing loved ones, calling into the piles of rubble that had once been their homes. Lafayette Park itself became a scene of unimaginable ruin. Once celebrated as one of the most beautiful public spaces in the Midwest, its trees some centuries old were stripped bare or snapped in half. The ornate iron fences twisted into grotesque shapes. Statues toppled. People who had sought shelter under the trees were killed or injured as trunks shattered and branches became missiles. In the aftermath, photographs showed the park as a wasteland, with little left to suggest its former elegance. Throughout the city, the tornado left a signature of chaotic selective destruction. One block was reduced to kindling while the next was left nearly intact. Survivors marveled at the randomness, a house obliterated while its neighbor's curtains remained untouched, but patterns did emerge. Structures of weaker construction, especially wooden cottages and frame houses, were destroyed almost universally. Brick homes sometimes survived, but often collapsed when their mortar gave way under the vibrations. Factories and warehouses, with broad roofs and thin supports, were shredded. Railroad cars were tossed like toys. The streets became unrecognizable. Wagons overturned, horses killed, wires dangling like lethal traps. Fires broke out where gas lines had ruptured, compounding the chaos. Rain and hail lashed down, soaking the wounded and complicating rescue attempts. In some districts, floodwaters pooled in the streets, forcing survivors to wade through knee-deep water mixed with ash, glass, and blood. The tornado did not just dismantle buildings, it transformed the very geography of neighborhoods. When the winds finally passed, silence followed, broken only by the cries of the injured and the shouts of rescuers. The destruction was so vast that many residents could not immediately recognize their own streets. A man emerging from his cellar looked around and asked neighbors where exactly he was, his familiar landmarks erased in a matter of minutes. The psychological impact was as profound as the physical. A thriving metropolis suddenly looked like a war zone, stripped bare by forces no human could control. The St. Louis tornado's path through the city remains one of the most destructive urban strikes in American history. Unlike rural tornadoes that cut swathes across farmland, this storm devastated a city at its very core. Lafayette Square, Compton Heights, Mill Creek Valley all became symbols of fragility in the face of nature's might. What residents had believed permanent was revealed as temporary, vulnerable, and fragile. After laying waste to much of St. Louis, the tornado crossed the Mississippi River. It struck Eads Bridge, one of the city's engineering marvels, but even here it left its mark. A wooden plank, 2 inches thick, was driven through a wrought iron plate, demonstrating force beyond comprehension. The bridge, completed in 1874, was a symbol of modern progress, built of steel and stone to withstand the demands of a growing industrial hub. Its survival during the tornado became a point of pride, but it also showed how close the storm came to dismantling even the strongest of structures. Eyewitnesses on the bridge described being nearly blown into the river as winds tore across the span, lifting dust, boards, and even sections of rail track into the air. Horses pulling wagons panicked, bolting and dragging carts dangerously close to the edge. That the bridge stood was a testament to its engineering, but its scars bore silent witness to the storm's unimaginable force. Once across, the storm did not weaken. In fact, the broad, flat terrain of East St. Louis offered little resistance. The funnel carved into the city with renewed violence, hitting neighborhoods and commercial blocks without mercy. For East St. Louis, a city already struggling with poverty and industrial hazards, the tornado was nothing short of catastrophic. Along the riverfront, the destruction was nearly total. Warehouses filled with grain, lumber, and manufactured goods were smashed to splinters. Barges tied along the shore were torn loose, some flipped entirely. The river, usually a highway of trade, became a dumping ground of wreckage, floating beams, roof shingles, and bodies carried downstream. For days afterward, debris continued to wash ashore, a haunting reminder of what the storm had left behind. A quarter of East St. Louis' structures were damaged or destroyed. That meant not just homes, but stores, taverns, and entire city blocks. Families returned to find their neighborhoods unrecognizable, streets buried under collapsed walls and tangled wires. Some survivors described wandering through fields of rubble, unable to locate where their own houses once stood. The Vandalia Railroad freight yards were among the hardest hit. These yards were busy that evening, filled with workers finishing their shifts and trains loaded with goods. The tornado struck with lethal precision. Boxcars weighing thousands of pounds were lifted and hurled like toys. Steel rails bent into twisted shapes. 35 men lost their lives in that yard alone, crushed beneath timbers and rail cars, their bodies pinned so tightly that rescue crews labored for hours to recover them. The destruction of the freight yards also crippled commerce, severing one of the city's key arteries of trade. Homes near the river vanished in seconds. Entire families were caught in collapsing walls or blown into the open streets. Survivors clung to tree stumps, fence posts, or whatever fragments of foundation remained. In some districts, there was nothing left but bare ground and scattered debris. Whole rows of houses were erased as if they had never been built. For those who lived, the trauma of seeing their world obliterated in minutes was overwhelming. Commercial districts fared no better. East St. Louis' downtown area was reduced to rubble, storefronts collapsed inward, merchandise scattered across muddy streets. Taverns and hotels, once places of gathering and rest, were gutted, leaving shattered glass and overturned tables. Some establishments caught fire from broken gas lines, their flames adding to the chaos as survivors tried desperately to extinguish blazes while pulling neighbors from debris. The devastation on the Illinois side underscored the tornado's scale. St. Louis had suffered terribly, but East St. Louis bore equal, if not greater, pain. It was a city already vulnerable, where many residents lived in simple frame houses or crowded boarding rooms. These structures, no match for hurricane-force winds, collapsed instantly. The tornado did not discriminate, striking both the wealthy merchant offices and the poorest shacks, but the poorest bore the heaviest losses, with little insurance or savings to rebuild. When dawn came the next morning, East St. Louis resembled a battlefield. Entire neighborhoods flattened, smoke rising from smoldering fires, survivors dazed and wandering. The freight yard was a scene of twisted iron and lifeless bodies. Churches lay in ruins, schools reduced to piles of brick. It was a city brought to its knees in less than half an hour, its scars lasting for decades. By the time the tornado passed, at least 255 people were confirmed dead. Some estimates place the toll higher, possibly over 400. More than 1,000 injured, many permanently. Thousands more lost homes or saw their livelihoods erased. Over 5,000 people left homeless, many having lost all possessions. In terms of property and infrastructure, about 311 buildings destroyed, severely damaged was another 7,200, and additional damage to around 1,300 more structures. Damages estimated over $10 million in 1896 currency, equivalent to nearly $5.3 billion today. Some groups suffered disproportionately. Poorer neighborhoods in Mill Creek Valley, less sturdy housing were devastated. Institutions housing the vulnerable were in the path. The city poorhouse, hospital wings, many inside, had no chance once walls began to buckle. Shock spread through the city not just at the scale of loss, but at the immediacy. People pulled victims from rubble, bodies washed downriver. Some may not have been counted. Though detailed personal narratives are fewer than modern disasters, archives and newspapers preserved glimpses of individual suffering and heroism. Many accounts describe people saved by sheltering under strong furniture, church attendees torn from pews, or factory workers caught in machinery and debris. Others tell of ambulances and medical corps springing into action, though roads were blocked, wires downed, communication disrupted. One dramatic instance, the Vandalia Railroad Freight Yard in East St. Louis. In those crowded yards with workers and freight, the tornado struck with almost no warning. Many lost their lives instantly under roofs, girders, train cars. For those who survived, the image of twisted metal, scattered cargo, and a river of ruin remained. Another, Lafayette Park, trees snapped like twigs, the park's usual tranquil expanses shattered. Later, visitors and photographers arrived to walk through the ruins of a neighborhood park turned wasteland. Though exact timing is imperfect, clocks were fewer, watches less reliable. The core devastation took place in about 20 minutes. From first touch in St. Louis to final movement in East St. Louis, the tornado's most lethal passage lasted such a brief span. Yet those minutes compressed tragedies, decisions, escapes, deaths. For many, the storm came with almost no warning. Streets blocked, telegraph wires destroyed, communications severed. In the immediate aftermath, shock, confusion, many injured lay trapped. Rescue efforts fell to volunteer groups, city militias, hospital corps, Light Battery A and the 1st Regiment among those mobilized quickly, providing help, bringing ambulances, bandages, and carrying the wounded. The streets were impassable. Without telegraph and telephone communications, many messages had to be carried by messengers or couriers' bicycles, foot. Hospitals overflowed. The dead were counted, but the missing may never be. Bodies in the Mississippi River, unrecorded deaths in buildings collapsed beyond recognition. Cleanup was massive. Debris removal, clearing roads. Torn boards, broken beams, shattered glass, splintered trees everywhere. Within weeks, thousands of sightseers came from within and beyond Missouri and Illinois, drawn by horror, curiosity, and sympathy. Photographers came, artists sketched, news spread. The destruction was documented and visualized in print, in magazines, in postcards. Despite the scale, life had to go on. The city prepared for the 1896 Republican National Convention scheduled for June, only a few weeks later. Organizers and city officials feared cancellation, but the convention went ahead after a massive cleanup and reconstruction push. The tornado's effects rippled beyond the immediate death and destruction. Politically, it influenced the city elections of 1897. Middle-class reform candidates looking to modernize infrastructure, improve housing were defeated in part because many neighborhoods heavily impacted had strong immigrant or working-class populations whose votes shifted. In terms of urban planning, some neighborhoods were permanently reshaped. Areas that once had densely packed wooden homes were rebuilt more solidly in some parts, but many vulnerable housing zones remained impoverished. The course of residential and commercial development shifted away from hardest-hit zones. Economic activity, trade routes, railroads all had to contend with the wreckage and then rebuild. Culturally, the tornado entered local memory, known as the Great Cyclone. Schools, history books, museums preserved its story. Archival photographs survive, showing demolished churches, smashed factories, ruined districts. Public library exhibitions, newspaper retrospectives all captured its magnitude. From a meteorological perspective, the event raised awareness even if early forecasting tools were crude. It emphasized the destructive potential when urban centers lie in the path of violent weather. It also highlighted socioeconomic inequalities, who were able to build sturdier, safer structures, who were most vulnerable, and who recovered fastest. Lessons that echo into tornado planning today. By measures of death toll, the St. Louis East St. Louis tornado remains among the deadliest U.S. tornadoes. It is the third deadliest in U.S. history as of its occurrence, only exceeded by the tri-state tornado of 1925 and a few others. In property damage, over 12,000 buildings seriously damaged or destroyed. Combined with indirect losses, business disruptions, housing losses, the cost remedied in the tens of millions in 1896 dollars. Adjusted for inflation, this places the event among the costliest tornadoes ever. Comparatively, the size of tornado outbreaks in 1896 late may rank among the worst in U.S. history. In that week of May 24-28, multiple large long-track storms struck. The infrastructure for measuring tornado strength would not come until much later, so much of the rating is reconstructed from damage and records. For this tornado, modern researchers assign an F4 rating. Though the human response was courageous, many things failed. Many people had no warning. Construction was ill-equipped for high winds. Building codes were non-existent or unenforced. Mortality was higher in poorer areas. Communication shattered immediately. The river crossing complicated rescue, and bodies lost to the Mississippi likely remain uncounted. Some victims in East St. Louis died in places with little access to medical care. The speed of destruction outpaced capacity to respond. Recovery was uneven. Some wealthy districts rebuilt quickly, but many poorer residents had no insurance, no savings. Many families were displaced for months. Homeless camps, temporary housing, charity helps, but scars remain. Psychologically, survivors carried trauma. Entire institutions, homes, lives lost. The tornado exposed inequalities the wealthy could mobilize. The poor were left much more vulnerable. In the days after the tornado, amid wreckage, something remarkable happened. Communities that had been divided by class or ethnicity came together in relief. Volunteers, clergy, neighbors helped rescue, share food, shelter, clothing. Newspapers around the nation, even the world, carried images of destruction. Donations arrived. Relief efforts coalesced. Politically, infrastructure improvements were debated. Reinforced building materials, better zoning, wider streets. Some city leaders saw that if St. Louis was to remain a major American metropolis, it needed to reckon with nature's potential. The 1897 elections, though a defeat for reformers, were deeply influenced by the fallout from the tornado. The physical scars of the storm lasted for decades. Some blocks never fully regained the old homes. Entire neighborhoods shifted character. Compton Heights, Lafayette Square, Mill Creek Valley all changed. The event became a measuring point in city histories. For Lafayette Square, the destruction was so profound that the neighborhood's very identity altered. Once a showcase of elegant mansions and carefully tended gardens, it became a district of ruins. Rebuilding took years, and many families never returned. Instead, the lots were sold off, subdivided, or redeveloped into less ornate housing. National imagination. Postcards and lithographs made from these photographs were sold as souvenirs and distributed as mementos. Some bore captions like "The Great Cyclone of St. Louis, 1896, turning tragedy into a form of commodity, but also ensuring that the memory of the storm was preserved in countless personal collections. Even today, these images resurface in museums, libraries, and online archives, giving modern viewers a haunting glimpse of the disaster. The St. Louis Public Library and the Missouri Historical Society maintain collections of these materials, displaying them in exhibitions that remind visitors of the city's vulnerability. In these exhibits, before and after photographs of Lafayette Park show a once-lush refuge reduced to stumps. Bridges bear scars of immense force. Rows of businesses once bustling with trade appear as little more than piles of brick and timber. Standing before these images, one cannot help but imagine the human cost hidden within the rubble. The artistic renditions of the storm also contributed to its legacy. Illustrators for national magazines sketched scenes of chaos. Carriages tossed into the air, terrified families running through streets filled with flying debris, rooftops tumbling like toys. Though often exaggerated, these sketches amplified the sense of terror and awe surrounding the tornado. They made the storm not just a local catastrophe, but a story of national significance. These archives serve not only as historical documentation, but also as visceral reminders of what a city can lose in minutes. For St. Louisans of later generations, they provided a tangible connection to ancestors who lived through one of the deadliest tornadoes in American history. For historians and scientists, they remain vital records that help reconstruct the path, force, and human impact of the cyclone. The legacy of the Great Cyclone of 1896, therefore, is twofold. Physically, it reshaped the city, altering neighborhoods and leaving scars visible for decades. Culturally and scientifically, it became a benchmark, a turning point that influenced how people thought about storms, safety, and the fragility of human constructions in the face of nature's power. It is remembered not only in books and academic studies, but also in the stories passed down through families, in the postcards that circulated across the country, and in the haunting images preserved in archives. Even today, when modern St. Louis braces for severe weather, the ghost of the 1896 cyclone lingers. Storm sirens echo across the city with an urgency rooted in memory. The event remains a reminder that no matter how advanced technology becomes, No city is beyond the reach of nature's fury. The Great Cyclone was not only a disaster of its age, it was a warning to all ages about the enduring need for vigilance, preparedness, and resilience. What if warnings had been better? What if housing had been stronger? What if architectural and building practices had considered high-wind resilience? Could hundreds of lives have been saved? We cannot know. But looking back, we see that many of those killed were in buildings unfit for such storms. Many injuries could possibly have been mitigated. Today, St. Louis remains in tornado country. Urban planning, storm shelters, building codes are strong, but storms remain unpredictable. The memory of that May Day in 1896 continues to influence how the city responds when blackened skies gather. History does not just preserve the past, it informs the present. 20 minutes of a cyclone, minutes that rearranged lives, neighborhoods, a city's destiny. The Great Cyclone of 1896 is not just a disaster memorialized, it is a lesson, a reminder of nature's force, of human frailty, of the value of preparedness, community, compassion under destruction. In the old photographs, one sees flattened homes, empty streets, shattered trees. But also one sees people standing among rubble, helping neighbors, rebuilding. Though the tornado crushed, it could not silence resilience. Though it was destroyed, it sparked conversations about safety, about solidarity, about what it means to rebuild. The day St. Louis was torn apart was more than a moment of loss. It was a turning point. And though over a century has passed, its echoes remain in every storm warning, every rebuilding effort, every hand extended in comfort. Nature's wrath was brutal. Humanity's slow, imperfect, but enduring response became part of the city's story.